Before we begin today's episode, we'll be discussing cultural attitudes toward work, class, and the growing divide between institutions and everyday Americans. This includes perspectives on education, media, and how different professions are valued in today's society. Our goal is to explore how these narratives are shaping perception, opportunity, and respect across the country. As always, we encourage listeners to approach the conversation with critical thinking, context, and an openness to different viewpoints.
There was a clip floating around this week. Comedian joking about plumbers, blue-collar work, the usual punchline. And it wasn't just the joke. It was the tone behind it. That subtle, you didn't go to college, so you must have messed up somewhere energy. And I think a lot of people heard that and thought the same thing.
Hold on a second.
Because the guy fixing your pipes, wiring your house, building your roads, he's not the punchline. He's the reason your life works. And somewhere along the line, we flipped that. We went from respecting people who build things, fix things, keep the country running, to acting like if you didn't sit in a lecture hall for 4 years and rack up debt, you somehow took a wrong turn. And now? Now you've got a generation buried in student loans, while the guy everyone used to joke about is making 6 figures and can't find enough help. So tonight, we're asking a simple question. When did working hard stop being respected? And maybe more importantly, who decided that? All right, let's bring in the crew because I've got a feeling this one's going to hit close to home for a lot of people. Brian's here, and I already know he's about to go off on the idea that somehow working with your hands became less than. He's probably ready to flip that narrative real quick. Rachel's here to keep us grounded, break down where this shift actually came from, education trends, workforce data, all that. Daniel's going to connect the dots, because you don't get a cultural shift like this without systems pushing it in a certain direction. And Skylar will give the counter. That maybe it's not about disrespect, but changing economic demands and opportunity structures. And me? I'm just trying to figure out how we got to a place where the guy fixing your house gets looked down on by the guy who can't fix his own sink. Let's get into it. Let's start with something simple, because this didn't happen overnight. For decades, the message has been pretty consistent. Go to college, get a degree. That's the path to success. And anything outside of that, trades, manual labor, blue-collar work, got quietly pushed into this backup plan category. Not officially, but culturally. In how people talk, in how schools guide students, in how media portrays success. And now we're seeing the results. Massive student debt, shortages in skilled labor, and a growing realization that the system might not have been telling the full story. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't just economic. It's cultural. It's about respect. It's about how society values different kinds of work. So Rachel, let me start with you. When you look at this shift, from valuing trades to pushing college as the primary path, what actually drove that change? Where did this start?
When you look at this shift over time, it really starts in the late 20th century, when higher education became more widely accessible and increasingly positioned as the primary path to economic mobility. There was a strong push from institutions, policymakers, and even cultural messaging that framed college not just as an option, but as the correct option, something that responsible, forward-thinking individuals were expected to pursue. At the same time, trades and blue-collar professions didn't disappear, but they were gradually reframed in a quieter, more subtle way as secondary paths, often described as alternatives rather than equal choices. That messaging filtered into schools, where guidance counselors emphasized college placement rates, into media, where success stories almost always involved degrees and corporate careers, and into households where parents, wanting stability for their kids, repeated the same advice. Over time, that created a perception gap, where the value of skilled labor didn't actually decrease in reality, but the perception of it did. And once perception shifts at scale, it begins to influence how entire generations make decisions about their future.
Yeah, and that's the part that sticks with me. Because what you just laid out isn't some overnight change or some conspiracy theory floating around online. It's decades of messaging that slowly shaped how people think about success. And it worked so well that most people didn't even question it at the time. You had schools pushing college as the default path, media reinforcing that idea, and families repeating it because they genuinely believed they were giving good advice. And before you know it, you've got an entire generation believing that if you're not sitting in an office somewhere with a degree on the wall, then you somehow didn't make it. But here's where it starts to feel disconnected from reality. Because while all that messaging was happening, the actual economy didn't stop needing electricians, plumbers, mechanics, builders, the people who physically keep everything running. And now we're seeing what happens when perception drifts too far from reality. You've got people buried in debt, industries desperate for skilled labor, and a growing number of folks starting to realize that maybe the path they were sold wasn't the only path, or even the best one for everyone. So, Brian, let me bring you in here, because I know this one hits a nerve for you. When you see this shift over time, do you look at it as a mistake we're now correcting, or does it feel like something deeper, like a cultural mindset that still hasn't caught up with reality?
Artie, I think Rachel nailed the timeline, but where I'm going to push a little harder is on the impact. Because this wasn't just a harmless shift in preference, it was a full-blown cultural rebranding of what success looks like. And it came with a cost that people are only now starting to feel. We basically told an entire generation that if you didn't go to college, you were settling. And we dressed it up in nice language like opportunity and career growth. But underneath it was a very clear message about status, about what kind of work was respected and what kind wasn't. And the irony now is almost unbelievable, because the same people who were told they needed a degree to succeed are now sitting there with massive debt, working jobs that don't even require the degree they paid for, while the guy everyone used to joke about, the plumber, the welder, the electrician, is booked out for weeks and making serious money. And I've got to say it because it deserves to be said with a little humor. We spent years acting like working with your hands was something you fall back on, and now half the country can't even hang a shelf without watching a tutorial, but somehow still thinks they're in a position to look down on the guy who can build an entire house from scratch. That's not just a disconnect, that's upside-down logic. And I think what we're seeing right now is reality slowly correcting that narrative, whether people like it or not.
Yeah, upside down logic is exactly what it feels like. Because when you step back and look at it, the people who physically keep society running somehow ended up at the bottom of the cultural respect ladder. And that doesn't line up with how important those roles actually are. And I think what makes this even more interesting is that this wasn't just random. It didn't just happen naturally. There were systems, incentives, and messaging that all pushed things in this direction over time. And that's where I want to bring Daniel in. Because whenever you see a shift this big, there's usually something behind it driving it forward. So, Daniel, when you look at how we got here, from valuing skilled labor to quietly devaluing it in the culture, what do you see happening behind the scenes that led to this kind of shift?
When you zoom out and look at this from a systems perspective, what stands out is that this wasn't just a cultural drift. It was an alignment of incentives that all pointed in the same direction for a long period of time. Universities expanded, funding models rewarded enrollment growth, and degrees became a kind of economic product that institutions were incentivized to promote as widely as possible, while at the same time, industries that relied on skilled labor didn't have the same marketing power or institutional backing to compete in that narrative. Add to that the rise of corporate and knowledge-based economies, where white-collar work was increasingly associated with stability, upward mobility, and prestige, and you get a feedback loop where the more people pursued those paths, the more they were reinforced as the correct choice. Meanwhile, trades didn't become less valuable in reality, but they became less visible in the cultural spotlight, which is often just as important when it comes to shaping perception. And once that perception gap grows wide enough, it starts to affect policy decisions, education priorities, and even how younger generations define success before they've ever had real-world exposure to different career paths. So what we're seeing now isn't just a sudden correction. It's the result of a system that overcorrected in one direction for decades and is now being pulled back by economic reality, labor demand, and the simple fact that you can't run a country without people who actually build, fix, and maintain the physical world.
Yeah, and that's where this really starts to come into focus. Because when you hear it laid out like that, it doesn't sound random at all. It sounds like a system that kept reinforcing itself until it pushed things out of balance. And I think what hits people is realizing that while all of that was happening, nobody really stopped to ask whether we were undervaluing something essential, because the messaging was so consistent that it just became accepted as truth. But Skylar, I want to bring you in here because this is where the pushback usually comes in. Because not everyone sees this as disrespect or a war on working class value. Some people see it as an evolution of the economy, a shift toward different types of work, and an attempt to create more opportunity through education. So from your perspective, is this being overstated as a cultural problem, or do you think there's a legitimate argument that something important was lost in how we started valuing different kinds of work?
I think there's truth in what's being said about perception, but I would frame it a little differently because I don't think the shift was originally about disrespect as much as it was about responding to economic changes that were happening at the time. As industries evolved and technology advanced, there was a real push to prepare people for jobs that required different kinds of skills, and higher education became one of the main ways to access those opportunities. Over time, that created a strong association between degrees and upward mobility, which made sense in a lot of cases, especially when certain sectors were growing rapidly and offering higher wages for those qualifications. But where I do think the issue comes in is that the messaging became too one-directional, where college was presented not just as a path, but as the path. And that left less room for recognizing the value of alternatives. So, while I wouldn't necessarily call it intentional disrespect, I do think there was a narrowing of how success was defined, and that had real consequences. Now we're seeing a correction, where people are starting to reevaluate those assumptions and recognize that stability, income, and fulfillment can come from multiple directions, not just one. And I think the challenge moving forward is finding a way to expand opportunity without unintentionally devaluing other forms of work that are just as essential to how society functions.
You know, listening to all of this, I think what really stands out is that nobody here is saying education is a bad thing. Nobody's saying opportunity is a bad thing. And nobody's saying people shouldn't chase whatever path works best for them. That's not the point. The point is what happens when one path gets elevated so high that everything else gets quietly pushed below it. Not by necessity, but by perception, by messaging, and by how we talk about success as a culture. Because when that happens, you don't just change career choices, you change how people view each other. You change what gets respected, and you change what gets overlooked. And I think that's where the frustration comes from for a lot of people. Because they're looking around and realizing that the people who keep everything running, the people building, fixing, maintaining the world we live in, somehow ended up being treated like they took a lesser path. And that doesn't sit right when you actually think about how essential those roles are. And maybe what we're seeing right now isn't a sudden shift. Maybe it's a correction, a moment where reality is catching up to perception, where people are starting to realize that value isn't determined by a degree on a wall. It's determined by what you contribute, what you build, and how you show up every day. And if that realization leads to a little more respect across the board, a little more balance in how we talk about work, then maybe something good actually comes out of all this.
All right, before we wrap this up, let's take a second to recognize the people who keep this show going. Because if today's conversation hit home for you, if you've ever felt like the kind of work you do doesn't always get the respect it deserves, This is exactly what Data and Dissonance is built for. And one of the best ways to support the show is through the Data and Dissonance merch and coffee line, which isn't just about products, it's about representing a mindset, one that values hard work, independent thinking, and speaking your mind without apology. We've got everything from hoodies, tees, and hats to some of our most popular bumper stickers like "Make Orwell Fiction Again," "Keep Your Feelings Off My Freedoms," and "Triggered? Good." All designed for people who aren't afraid to push back a little and think for themselves. And of course, the coffee. Because let's be honest, conversations like this usually start early and run long. So whether you're going with the High Lakes Light Roast, the Rock Creek Medium, or the Bitterroot Dark French Roast, it's all roasted right here in the USA and built for people who wake up and get after it every day. You can find everything at the merch store and on the website. And every single purchase helps keep this show independent, growing, and able to keep having conversations like the one we had today.
You know, the more I think about this conversation, the more it feels like we're not just talking about jobs or education. We're talking about how a culture decides what matters. And for a long time, we started measuring value in a very narrow way, where success was tied to titles, degrees, and office jobs, while the people actually building, fixing, and maintaining the world around us were quietly pushed into the background. And that shift didn't just change career paths, it changed respect, it changed perception, and it changed how people saw themselves. Because when you tell someone over and over that their path is a backup plan, eventually that message starts to stick, even if it was never true to begin with. But what we're seeing now is reality pushing back. Because no matter how much messaging you put out, you can't run a country without skilled labor. You can't automate everything, and you can't replace the value of people who know how to work with their hands and solve real-world problems. And I think that's where this moment matters, because it's not about tearing down one path to lift another up. It's about restoring balance. It's about recognizing that success doesn't come in one form, and that respect shouldn't be handed out based on perception, but earned through contribution. Because at the end of the day, the person keeping your lights on, fixing your plumbing, building your home, or maintaining your infrastructure isn't less than anyone else. They're essential. And maybe it's time we start treating it that way again, not just in how we talk, but in how we guide the next generation. And if this conversation does anything, I hope it gets people thinking a little differently, questioning the narratives they were handed, and maybe even looking at the people around them with a little more appreciation. Because the truth is, this country doesn't run on titles. It runs on people who show up every day and do the work. And that deserves respect, plain and simple. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Today's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, where the same themes we talk about on this show, power, control, systems, and the people navigating them, come to life in a high-stakes, action-driven story. If you enjoy conversations about how the world really works behind the scenes, you'll want to check out The Covenant Protocol, The Prophet Directive, and Black Echo Rising, all available now and continuing the story of Caleb Rourke as he moves through a world shaped by decisions most people never see. It's also brought to you by the music behind the show, including the album Uncaged, which leans into a raw, grunge-inspired sound built from real-life struggle and resilience, and Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, a country album rooted in faith, family, and the everyday people who keep this country moving forward. Songs like Stand Tall Charlie carry that same message of strength and conviction, and you can find all of it on Spotify and major streaming platforms, along with everything connected to the show, merch, coffee, and more, through the website. Independent stories, independent music, and an independent voice. And that's what Data and Dissonance is all about.